Hello, my name is Markellos Baez. I have here Caleb Fleming and Ko Sekiguchi with me, and this is our ENG6 project. So for our project, we decided to do Go Fish as our game. And so for the beginning of our code, we have the startup function that runs as soon as the game opens. And so of course you have the title screen, right? That displays all the information you need to know if you never played the game before. It gives you the instructions of how to win, how the turns work, what your goal is, and the type of inputs you should be putting in, so that way the code runs as advertised. Then also you have the player selection. You choose player one or two, depending who wants to go first or second, and that helps determine the turn order. And then the optional music feature, right? So you can turn that on or off if you want music first for personal enjoyment. And then once you click start, it runs through the code of start button pressed, or yeah, there you go. So once the start button's pressed, depending on if you're player one or player two, it does a couple things, right? So that even happens, it creates the deck of cards. They're titled like Ace Club, Ace Hearts, Ace Diamond. And so it creates an array of cards, and then it turns it into a long string. So the way we created our playing deck was we made an array filled with all 52 cards, four hands of playing cards. And we combined it down into one string, one long string, using the join function that will, you know, make it one long string so that ThinkSpeak can accept it. A lot simpler. And so each card is divided by a slash symbol to differentiate where one card is and where the next card starts. And so we give that to ThinkSpeak as our deck. And then once we read it from ThinkSpeak, we take it as is, and then we break it apart again using a split function to split the singular string back into an assortment of smaller strings of each individual card. And so that's all done through player one. That way, both players aren't making their own random decks. Player one makes a deck. He assigns the cards to player one and player two, so they each have their own five starting cards. And then the rest is just left in the playing deck as is. And that's all uploaded into ThinkSpeak, where ThinkSpeak has a category for the playing deck that's remaining after card assignment, player one deck, player two deck, which is each five cards, and then the current player, right? And so player one runs first. He gets his turn, right? He gets to do either requesting a card, or he gets to draw a card depending on the outcomes, which we'll talk about later. And then if you're player two, you instead have to wait. You have to wait for the first player in a function we created called wait for the other player. And they'll talk about that later as well. But essentially, player two waits for player one to finish. And then once that's done, he essentially repeats the process player one did, where he can either request a card and steal it from player one and attempt to make a book, or he has to go fish and draw a card. And so I'll pass it on to Ko and Caleb to talk about the rest of the code.
So I think we should start with the request button from here. So we have on our screen, which is covered by these curtains, because on the left side you can see these blue. These will go away and reveal the screen that you can play on. We'll show you later, but we have a input field where the player can input a number, and then from there they can click a button right beneath that which says request, which will show will actually sorry not show it will request that card and it'll send that through ThinkSpeak, and then it'll gather that information if the other person has the card and return that information. That's what our request function does in a very, very, very summarized nutshell. And next, I think we should talk about the draw button because it's kind of the next step after request. After the player requests a card, if the second player or the other player doesn't have that card, then they'll be forced to draw a card via the go fish function. This means that this draw button will appear on their screen and they'll click this button. It'll draw the next card in line from our randomized deck, which is stored in ThinkSpeak, and it will then pass the turn to the next player. Let's see. The next thing I think we should talk about is the sound. It is part of the start button pushed function, which Mark spoke of. So at the very end here, it's pretty much this is a separate sound that kind of displays a little card sound when you get dealt your hand at the beginning of the game when you start. It's our little sound for the game, and then we'll have that. And then I think we may have added it in a few places. I forget to be honest, but there's at least that there. And then the next thing is the go fish function. Let's see if we could find it here. The go fish function basically when the player requests a card that the other player doesn't have, it calls the draw button pushed function and allows that button to show up on the screen. That's pretty much it for those buttons. Next is Ko's turn.
Yes. So speaking more about after what happens after the player clicks the draw button, there will be a ready button um, that will pop up that will allow the players to press it. And if the current player is the player that pushed it, it'll enable the request button to pop up back again, so they can request cards from the other players. But if not, it'll give them a little button that says they will have to wait more time in order to request buttons from the other player, meaning that it's not their turn currently. And if we go back up to the startup, the functions, I want to explain more about the wait for other player function. So it's pretty self-explanatory, but the wait for other player um, allows the player to wait for their turn, and while doing so, they are gathering information from ThinkSpeak using the ThinkSpeak read function. They're gathering the app playing deck, current player, player one hand, and also player two hand. And then also speaking more about the update values. So the update values, like similar to the wait other player values or function, updates what ThinkSpeak is writing and reading, which is the playing deck, current player, player one hand, and player two hand. And also, as you can see, we have images that display during the course of our game in order to make the game more enjoyable.